Usually when you get a medical diagnosis, it's almost like engineering.
Right, it's very mechanical, very straightforward.
Exactly. Like you break your arm, you go get an x-ray, and the film shows this jagged white line.
Yeah.
And the doctor just points to it and says, yeah, there it is.
It's binary, it's clean, the bone is broken, or it isn't broken.
Yeah, and I think there's a profound psychological comfort in that kind of visibility.
Oh, absolutely, because you can physically isolate the problem from who you are as a person.
Right.
Your radius is fractured, sure, but your sense of self is perfectly intact. You are still you.
But then you step into the world of neuro-oncology. You step into the reality of brain cancer, and suddenly that X-ray machine, that comforting illusion of precision, it just shatters completely.
It really does. You're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
It's so murky.
Yeah.
Because it's not just a physical problem in a localized organ, right? It is a direct physiological challenge to the very essence of a person. Welcome to the Funeral Channel Network podcast.
So glad to be here to unpack this with you.
Today we are taking a deep dive, a really special exploration into the microscopic intricacies of brain cancer. We're looking at the deeply intentional symbolism of the gray ribbon and the just profoundly complex journey of the patients, the caregivers, and the survivors.
It's a journey that, well, it forces us to completely reevaluate our baseline understanding of illness.
Yeah.
Because when the disease resides in the organ that actually generates your consciousness, the standard rules of medicine, and honestly, the standard rules of grief, they have to be completely rewritten.
Exactly. And our mission today is to understand why that is. For those of you joining us, we've pulled together a massive stack of source material for this deep dive.
We really have. Medical research, firsthand caregiver testimonies, organizational insights.
Yeah, to really map out this landscape for you, we want to understand the biological mechanics of these tumors, the high wire act that surgeons face.
Which is just incredible.
Oh, it's mind-blowing. We're also going to look at the psychological concept of ambiguous loss for the families and how we ultimately memorialize the people who fight this battle.
It's a heavy topic, we acknowledge that, but it is also a masterclass in human resilience.
And scientific innovation, too. I mean, the sheer ingenuity required to treat the brain and the emotional fortitude required to care for someone going through it is staggering.
It really is.
So let's start right at the visual center of our source material, which is the gray awareness ribbon.
Okay, let's dive in.
When we think of awareness campaigns, we're usually conditioned to look for bright, eye-catching colors, right?
Oh, yeah. Neon pinks, bright reds, vibrant yellows.
Exactly. Colors that are specifically engineered to jump out at you from across a crowded room. They just demand your attention. But here, the symbol is gray.
It is.
So why was this specific, I guess you could call it a somewhat muted color, chosen to represent something so urgent and aggressive?
Well, it's actually a literal translation from anatomy to symbolism.
Okay, how so?
The gray awareness ribbon represents brain cancer because it directly reflects the color of the actual tissue we are talking about, gray matter.
Gray matter.
Yeah. It's a visual tether to the physical intricacy of the human brain.
Well, let's pause on that for a second, because I think a lot of people hear the term gray matter thrown around in pop culture.
Right, like use your gray matter.
Exactly. But we don't often stop to define what it actually does. If I'm remembering my basic biology correctly, the brain is roughly divided into gray matter and white matter, right?
That's right. If you want to think of the brain as a massive organic supercomputer.
Okay, I like that analogy.
The gray matter is the actual processing hardware. It contains the cell bodies of the neurons, the dendrites, and the synapses.
So it's where the heavy lifting happens.
Exactly. It's where the computations happen. It's where memories are stored, where emotions are generated, where muscle movements are initiated.
And the white matter.
The white matter is made up of the myelinated axons. Those are essentially the insulated cables that connect different parts of the gray matter to each other.
Oh, so they let the processing centers actually communicate.
You got it.
So when a tumor infiltrates the brain, it's not just taking up physical space, it's setting up camp right in the middle of the processing chips.
Precisely. And that's where the philosophical weight of this disease really hits you.
Yeah, I can see that.
Think about a cancer in another part of the body, say a bone or a lung. It is physically devastating, obviously.
Of course, it's life-threatening. The systemic effects are terrifying.
But the patient's cognitive self-fruition, their emotional processing, their ability to communicate their fear or their love to you, that usually remains intact until the very, very end stages of the disease.
Right, your personality doesn't fundamentally shift because of a tumor in your leg.
Exactly. You might be exhausted, you might be in extreme pain, but your spouse still recognizes the person they married.
But the physical location of brain cancer makes it uniquely devastating.
Uniquely. It doesn't just threaten biological health, it threatens cognitive and emotional functions. The disease fundamentally attacks the patient's identity.
Wow.
Yeah. Depending on exactly where the tumor is growing, it might press against the specific cluster of neurons responsible for impulse control, or language comprehension, or even facial recognition.
Which means the person you are talking to might suddenly become completely unable to find the words to respond to you.
Yes.
And not because they are tired, and not because they are confused, but because a physical mass is literally blocking the electrical pathway of their vocabulary.
Yes, exactly. It's a physical roadblock. And that brings an entirely different layer of grief and complexity to the diagnosis.
I can't even imagine.
So the gray ribbon, it isn't just an awareness tool. It's a profound acknowledgement of a highly internal, often completely invisible cognitive struggle.
I really appreciate that framing. So gray isn't a dull color here. It represents the ultimate control room of human existence.
That's a great way to put it.
It's the color of the hardware that makes us who we are. So when you pin that gray ribbon to your lapel, it's an inherently heavy, deeply respectful marker.
It really is. You are essentially telling the patient, I see the invisible battle happening inside your mind. It is a public display of support for the most private sanctuary a human being has.
That's powerful. But, well, the brain isn't a monolith, right? And neither are the tumors that attack it.
Not at all.
Let's move into the actual spectrum of the disease, because the clinical landscape in our sources here is wild.
It's vast.
The sources outline a biological reality that ranges from incredibly subtle, slow-growing anomalies to terrifyingly aggressive invasions.
Right. And to understand that spectrum, we first have to divide the landscape into two main categories, primary tumors and metastatic tumors.
Okay.
And that distinction is crucial for how oncologists actually approach treatment.
So metastatic tumors are the ones that start somewhere else, right? Like a patient has breast cancer or melanoma or lung cancer, and those rogue cells manage to break away, travel through the bloodstream, and take root in the brain.
Exactly. And the reason that is so biologically fascinating and obviously devastating is because the brain has an incredibly strict security system.
The blood-brain barrier.
The blood-brain barrier, yes.
Wow.
The blood vessels in the brain aren't like the blood vessels in your arm.
How are they different?
They are lined with endothelial cells that are packed incredibly tightly together. We call them tight junctions.
Okay.
They act like a microscopic bouncer at an exclusive club.
A bouncer, okay? I like that.
Yeah, selectively allowing essential nutrients like glucose to cross over while blocking toxins, pathogens, and ideally rogue cancer cells.
But the metastatic cells, they figure out a way to pick the lock.
They do. They develop genetic mutations that allow them to essentially trick the bouncer, squeeze through those tight junctions, and set up secondary tumors in the brain tissue.
That's terrifying.
It's a massive challenge in oncology because that same blood-brain barrier that failed to keep the cancer out is exceptionally good at keeping our chemotherapy drugs out.
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought of that. We're going to dive deep into that drug delivery problem in a minute because that is just fascinating.
That's a huge hurdle.
But let's look at the primary tumors first. These are the tumors that are actually born in the brain.
Right. Primary brain tumors.
The sources mention astrocytomas, meningiomas, and glioblastomas. Let's break those down, maybe starting with the environment they grow in.
Let's start with astrocytomas. So we talked about the gray matter and the neurons, right?
Yeah, the processing chips.
Right. But neurons don't survive on their own. They are supported by a vast network of cells called glial cells. It literally means the glue of the nervous system.
Ah.
And one of the most important types of glial cells are the astrocytes.
I love the naming convention in biology. Astro meaning star. They literally look like microscopic stars, don't they?
They do. They have these intricate branching tentacles, and their job is vital. They provide nutrients to the neurons, they maintain the chemical balance in the brain fluid,
Oh, wow.
and they actually help maintain that blood-brain barrier we just talked about.
A bouncer.
Right. But like any cell that divides, their genetic code can mutate. And when a star-shaped support cell mutates and begins dividing uncontrollably, you get an astrocytoma.
And how fast do those grow?
It really depends on the grade. They exist on a spectrum. A low-grade astrocytoma might grow very slowly over years, but a high-grade one can be incredibly aggressive.
Okay, so contrast that with a meningioma, because the sources point out that a meningioma often requires a completely different approach, sometimes even just watchful waiting.
Right. So to understand a meningioma, you have to look outside the actual brain tissue.
Outside of it.
Yeah, the brain isn't just sloshing around against your bare skull. It is wrapped in 3 protective layers of tissue called the meninges.
Okay, the wrapping paper.
Exactly. You have the dura mater, which is tough and leathery, right under the bone. Then the arachnoid mater, which you guessed it looks like a spider web.
Naturally.
And then the delicate pia mater, which clings directly to the brain's surface.
So a meningioma isn't actually a brain tumor in the strictest sense.
Biologically, no. It's a tumor of the wrapping paper, not the present. Meningiomas grow out of those protective layers.
Okay, but if it's outside the brain, why is it a problem?
Because the skull is a fixed, rigid box. As the tumor grows on the meninges, it has nowhere to go but inward. It presses inward on the actual brain tissue.
Oh, I see. It's a space issue.
Exactly. It's called mass effect. The brain is getting squished. But because meningiomas are often benign and very slow growing, a patient might live with one for years without knowing it.
Wow, really?
Yeah. If it's discovered accidentally on an MRI, maybe for a completely different issue and it isn't causing symptoms, a neurosurgeon might just say, let's leave it alone and scan it again in 6 months.
Watchful waiting, which, I mean, that sounds terrifying if you're the patient knowing there's a mass in your head, but biologically it makes sense.
It does. Sometimes the surgery is riskier than the slow-growing tumor.
But that we swing to the absolute opposite end of the spectrum in the source material. Glioblastoma multiforme, GBM.
Yes.
And the language used in the text to describe this tumor is just chilling. It's notoriously fast, aggressive, and highly resistant to treatment.
Glioblastoma is the apex predator of brain cancers.
The apex predator, wow.
It is a grade 4 astrocytoma, meaning it is the most malignant, rapidly dividing form. And the reason it is so difficult to treat goes back to the physical structure of the tumor itself.
Let me make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. Because when I used to picture a brain tumor, I pictured a marble stuck in a bowl of thick jelly.
A lot of people do.
You have this distinct, hard little sphere. And the surgeon goes in, carefully scoops out the marble, and leaves the jelly perfectly intact. But that's not what a glioblastoma is doing, is it?
Not even close. The marble analogy implies a clearly encapsulated mass with a distinct boundary.
Right.
A glioblastoma is more like the roots of a very aggressive weed growing through a cracked concrete sidewalk.
Oh, God.
It is highly infiltrative. It sends these microscopic, tentacle-like projections deep into the surrounding healthy brain tissue.
So it's woven into the brain.
Yes, woven right in, and it creates its own blood supply, a process called angiogenesis to feed its rapid growth.
It builds its own infrastructure.
Exactly. Furthermore, the center of a glioblastoma often grows so fast that the blood supply can't keep up. So the core of the tumor actually dies and becomes necrotic, while the outer edges aggressively expand outward.
That is horrifying.
It is. So when a surgeon looks at the primary mass on an MRI, they know for a fact that there are individual cancer cells that have already migrated millimeters or even centimeters away, hiding out in the normal neural pathways.
So you can never get it all.
You can never surgically remove 100% of a glioblastoma because you would have to remove too much healthy brain tissue.
Which brings up a massive question I had while reviewing the source material on symptoms.
Okay.
We've established that these tumors, whether they are pressing inward like a meningioma or infiltrating like a glioblastoma, they're taking up space in a rigid skull.
Right.
The sources list the primary symptoms:
Mm-hmm.
headaches, vision problems, difficulty with balance, changes in personality.
The classic indicators of elevated intracranial pressure or localized neurological deficits.
Right. But wait, headaches, occasional clumsiness,
Yeah.
mood swings. I mean, I trip over my dog and get screen-induced tension headaches every Tuesday.
Right, exactly.
And if I don't sleep well, my mood swings are definitely noticeable to everyone around me.
Yeah.
If the symptoms are that utterly mundane, how is anyone supposed to catch this early? How do you, for you listening right now, how do you know when a headache is just a headache and when it's a siren?
That is exactly the cruelty of the disease. You don't.
You don't.
And that is why early diagnosis of brain cancer is notoriously difficult. The symptoms perfectly mimic the everyday exhaustions of daily life.
So the disease literally hides in plain sight.
It does. And the mechanism behind why it hides is fascinating. It's rooted in something called the Monro-Kelly hypothesis.
Let's unpack that.
The skull is a fixed, rigid vault. Inside that vault, you have 3 things: brain tissue, blood, and cerebrospinal fluid.
Okay, tissue, blood, fluid.
If a tumor starts to grow, it introduces a fourth element. At first, the brain compensates. It actually squeezes out some of the cerebrospinal fluid, or it slightly reduces blood volume to make room for the tumor.
Wait, the brain is actively accommodating its own invader.
Exactly. It's trying to keep the intracranial pressure stable. And during this compensation phase, the symptoms might be non-existent or just a mild, vague headache.
Because the pressure hasn't spiked yet.
Right. But eventually, the tumor grows too large. The brain runs out of ways to compensate. There's no more fluid to squeeze out, and the pressure inside the skull spikes dramatically.
And that's when the mundane symptoms suddenly escalate into a crisis.
Exactly. That mild headache suddenly becomes a blinding, severe pain, particularly in the morning.
By the morning.
Because when you lie flat to sleep, fluid naturally pools in the head, and your breathing slows down, which retains a little bit of carbon dioxide, which dilates the blood vessels in the brain.
Taking up even more space.
Yes, taking up even more space, so the patient wakes up in agony. Or that slight clumsiness suddenly turns into a full-blown focal seizure.
That makes total sense biologically. And it highlights exactly why the Gray Ribbon Campaign focuses so heavily on symptom education.
It's crucial.
It's trying to establish new cultural thresholds for when we seek neurological help. The message is, we aren't asking you to get an MRI every time you bump your head, but if a headache is entirely new, persistent, and progressively worsening.
Or if a personality change is completely uncharacteristic and lasts for weeks.
Right. You cannot just brush it off as stress.
It's about recognizing patterns that deviate from your personal baseline. Because once that threshold is crossed and a patient finally gets that MRI, if the scan reveals an aggressive mass, the timeline shifts instantly.
You move from the slow ambiguity of everyday symptoms into a high-stakes medical emergency.
In an instant.
Which brings us to the treatment phase. Section 3 of our deep dive. The source material outlines the standard triad: surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy.
The big three.
But executing this triad in the brain, it sounds like the most terrifying high-wire act in all of medicine.
It's the ultimate surgical balancing act. In most other cancers, the goal is wide margins.
Wide margins, meaning taking extra tissue just in case.
Exactly. If you have a tumor in your colon, the surgeon doesn't just cut out the tumor. They cut out several inches of perfectly healthy colon on either side of it to ensure they got every last microscopic cancer cell.
But you can't take wide margins of the human brain.
Exactly. You cannot sacrifice an inch of healthy frontal lobe just to be safe. This brings us back to the spiderweb analogy. The bomb is tangled inside the physical web of the patient's consciousness.
Let's dig into how a surgeon actually navigates that. Because the sources talk about preserving critical brain functions. But how do they actually know what tissue does what while they are inside the skull? Isn't every brain slightly different?
Yes. Individual neuroanatomy varies a lot. And that's why neurosurgeons rely on a concept called eloquent versus non-eloquent tissue.
Eloquent tissue. That's a poetic name.
It is. Eloquent brain tissue directly controls highly observable critical functions: motor skills, sensory processing, language, and vision.
Okay.
If you damage eloquent tissue, the patient wakes up permanently paralyzed or blind or unable to speak. Non-eloquent tissue, while still important, can sometimes be resected with less obvious immediate deficits.
So the surgeon has to map the minefield before they step into it.
They do, and one of the most incredible ways they do this is through an awake craniotomy.
Okay, stop right there. Awake brain surgery.
Yes.
The very concept sounds like science fiction. Explain to me how that works and why it's necessary.
It's astonishing, honestly. The brain itself doesn't have pain receptors. The scalp and the skull do, but the actual gray matter does not feel pain.
Which is wild to think about.
So an anesthesiologist will put the patient to sleep to open the skull. Once the brain is exposed, they wake the patient up.
The patient is lying on an operating table with their skull open, having a conversation.
Exactly. And the neurosurgeon uses a tiny electrical probe to stimulate specific microscopic areas of the brain right next to the tumor.
Oh my God.
While they do this, a neuropsychologist is sitting next to the patient, showing them flashcards or asking them to play the guitar or just having them count backward from 100.
So if the surgeon touches a specific millimeter of tissue and suddenly the patient slurs their speech or stops counting,
the surgeon knows instantly, I cannot cut there. That millimeter of tissue is the patient's language center.
wow.
It's real-time, live-action functional mapping. They are literally tracing the boundary between the tumor and the patient's identity.
That is awe-inspiring and horrifying.
Yeah.
But mostly awe-inspiring.
It's the peak of medical precision.
But even with that incredible precision, We go back to the glioblastoma problem, the roots in the concrete.
Right.
Even the most brilliant surgeon doing an awake craniotomy is going to leave microscopic cancer cells behind in the eliquid tissue, which is where radiation and chemotherapy come in.
Right. Following surgery, the standard of care is usually fractionated radiation therapy. That means giving targeted doses of radiation over several weeks.
To kill the remaining cells without causing widespread necrosis to the healthy brain tissue.
Exactly. And this is typically paired with an oral chemotherapy drug called temozolomide.
And why that specific drug?
Because of the blood-brain barrier. Remember the bouncer at the club?
Yes, the tight junctions.
Most chemotherapy drugs are large molecules. They simply bounce off the blood-brain barrier, they circulate in the body, causing hair loss and nausea, but they never reach the brain tumor.
Oh, that's so frustrating.
It is. But temozolomide is lipophilic, meaning it's fat-soluble, and it's a very small molecule. It's one of the few chemo drugs that can actually slip past the bouncer, cross the barrier, and attack the glioblastoma cells.
But the sources indicate that even with surgery, radiation, and temozolomide, the recurrence rates for aggressive tumors are devastatingly high,
They are.
which pushes us to the cutting edge of the field. Let's talk about where the hope lives right now. The sources highlight two massive frontiers: precision medicine and immunotherapy.
This is where we stop looking at the organ and start looking at the genetic barcode.
Okay, explain that.
Historically, we treated brain cancer anatomically. You have a tumor in the left hemisphere, we will radiate the left hemisphere. Precision medicine treats it molecularly.
So we aren't carpet bombing anymore. We are sending in a sniper.
Precisely. When they biopsy the tumor, they run a full genomic sequence on it. They are looking for highly specific mutations.
Like what?
For example, is there a mutation in the IDH gene? Is the MGMT promoter methylated?
Okay, big words.
I know, these aren't just obscure scientific terms, though. These molecular signatures tell the oncologist exactly how the tumor is feeling itself, and more importantly, what specific drugs will shut off that fuel supply.
So two patients sitting in a waiting room, both with a glioblastoma in the exact same part of the brain, might receive entirely different drug cocktails based on the genetic spelling errors in their specific tumors.
Exactly. It's highly personalized therapy.
That's incredible.
But the other massive frontier, immunotherapy, takes a different approach entirely. Instead of finding a drug to kill the cancer, immunotherapy tries to train the patient's own immune system to do the job.
Which sounds elegant in theory. I mean, your immune system fights off the flu. Why can't it fight off cancer? But doesn't the brain have a unique relationship with the immune system?
You've hit on one of the biggest hurdles in neuro-oncology. The brain is what we call an immune-privileged site.
Immune privilege?
Yeah. Because the brain is so delicate, the body intentionally keeps the aggressive immune cells, the T cells and macrophages, out of the central nervous system most of the time.
Really? Why?
The body essentially says, a massive inflammatory immune response is great for a cut on your leg, but if we trigger massive swelling inside the rigid skull, the patient will die from the pressure.
Ah, the Monroe-Kelly hypothesis again.
Exactly. Space is limited.
So the brain's own self-defense mechanism protects the tumor from the immune system. The cancer cells are hiding in a demilitarized zone.
That is exactly what is happening. And on top of that, the cancer cells actively secrete chemicals that put any local immune cells to sleep. They essentially wear an invisibility cloak.
Sneaky.
Very. So the goal of immunotherapy, like CAR or T-cell therapy or checkpoint inhibitors, is to strip away that invisibility cloak, biochemically wake up the immune system, and give the T-cells a very specific set of coordinates to attack the tumor.
Without triggering a massive lethal wave of inflammation in the healthy brain tissue.
That's the tightrope walk.
How close are we to making that a reality?
We are making incremental, hard-fought progress. But the only way we are making that progress is through clinical trials.
I want to spend some time on this because reading the sources on clinical trials gave me an entirely new level of respect for these patients.
The bravery is staggering.
It really is. Think about the psychological state of a patient entering a phase 1 or phase 2 clinical trial.
It's a lot.
You have just been handed an aggressive, terrifying diagnosis. The standard treatments offer limited time. You are facing the great unknown. And by sitting down, reading a 50-page consent form, and saying yes to an experimental immunotherapy drug, you are not just seeking a lifeline for yourself.
No.
You are actively volunteering your own body, your own brain chemistry, to generate the data that might save a completely different family 10 years from now.
It is the ultimate act of scientific altruism in the face of profound personal trauma. Every single advancement we just talked about, every genomic sequence, every millimeter of progress in immunotherapy exists entirely because a patient allowed themselves to be the testing ground.
It redefines the concept of a legacy. But while the surgeons are mapping the brain, and the researchers are sequencing the DNA, and the patients are enduring the trials, there is another group of people enduring a completely different parallel marathon.
Yes.
And the source material dedicates a profound amount of focus to them. I'm talking about the caregivers.
The hidden front line, the unsung load-bearing walls of the entire medical system.
It's so true. The text calls caregiving a central pillar of the awareness movement. And I think society generally understands the physical and logistical burden of caregiving, right?
Sure, driving to the hospital.
Yeah. If your spouse gets sick, you are going to be driving to appointments. You're going to be picking up prescriptions. But the specific reality of a brain cancer caregiver goes so far beyond meal prep and driving.
The logistical burden alone is staggering, especially navigating the complexities of the modern healthcare system. Managing insurance pre-authorizations for daily radiation, coordinating physical therapy, administering multiple timed medications to prevent seizures.
It's a full-time job.
A caregiver is essentially acting as a full-time, unpaid hospital administrator.
But the logistics, as crushing as they are just the background noise. The true core of the caregiver's burden, according to the sources, is the emotional and psychological toll of adapting to the patient's cognitive changes.
This is the hardest part.
We touched on this earlier, but we need to dive deep here. As a caregiver for a brain cancer patient, you are actively mourning the shifting identity of the person you love, while they are still sitting right in front of you.
In psychological terms, this is known as ambiguous loss. It was a concept pioneered by Dr. Pauline Boss. It describes the unique, freezing grief of a situation where a person is physically present, but psychologically absent or profoundly altered.
It's like mourning a ghost who's eating breakfast at your kitchen table.
Yes, it's exactly like that. If a patient has a tumor in the frontal lobe, the changes can be utterly disorienting for the family. The frontal lobe is the seat of our executive function.
Executive function, what does that cover?
It is the engine of our empathy, our impulse control, our social filter, our ability to plan for the future.
So if the tumor starts destroying those specific circuits,
the filter vanishes. A spouse who was historically gentle, patient, and quiet might suddenly become hyper-aggressive, verbally abusive, or wildly inappropriate in public.
That is heartbreaking.
Or conversely, a vibrant, outgoing parent might become completely apathetic, just staring blankly at the wall, unable to initiate a simple conversation or show affection.
and the caregiver has to absorb that every single day. They have to manage the physical danger of a patient who might suddenly forget how to use the stove and leave the gas on, while simultaneously absorbing the emotional trauma of being screamed at by a partner who no longer recognizes them.
And they have to do it with a superhuman level of cognitive dissonance.
What do you mean?
They have to constantly remind themselves, minute by minute, that is the tumor talking, that is the cerebral edema, that is not my husband, that is not my wife.
Which requires an emotional endurance that most people simply do not possess.
And that is exactly why the Gray Ribbon explicitly honors caregivers alongside the patients. Because when the patient's brain, their internal compass begins to fail them, the caregiver has to step in and become their external anchor to reality.
The external anchor.
Yes. The caregiver holds the memories. The caregiver interprets the present. The caregiver dictates the future. They carry the identity of two people on their shoulders.
This highlights a critical, actionable point from the sources regarding support systems. The texts list counseling, community programs, and respite care as essential tools.
Absolutely essential.
And reading between the lines of the psychological torment you just described, we have to completely reframe how we view these services. Respite care isn't a luxury. It's not a spa day. Therapy isn't just a nice bonus. These are absolute medical necessities for the survival of the family unit.
They are critical infrastructure. If the caregiver collapses under the psychological weight of ambiguous loss or the sheer physical exhaustion of 247 hypervigilance, the entire care system for the patient disintegrates. You cannot be the external anchor to reality for someone else if you yourself are untethered.
It's the classic put your own oxygen mask on first rule, but applied to a marathon of psychological endurance.
Precisely. And the community programs are vital for combating the intense isolation. Because unless you have watched a spouse's personality dissolve due to a frontal lobe mass, you cannot truly understand the specific flavor of that grief.
No one else gets it.
Sitting in a room with other caregivers who just inherently know who not, when you say your husband yelled at you for the color of the sky, that shared validation is life-saving.
Okay, we've walked through the complex biology of the brain, the terrifying physical mechanics of the tumors, the high-wire surgical act of trying to defuse the bomb in the spiderweb, and the grueling, ambiguous loss endured by the caregivers.
It's a heavy journey.
But the source material also guides us into the aftermath. Because whether this journey ends in survivorship, and there is immense growing hope in survivorship, which we will discuss, or whether it ends in clinical loss, the family is left in a vacuum.
The silence after the storm.
The frenetic energy of the medical battle stops. And they need profound ways to process the experience and honor the person.
The transition from the active medical battlefield to the landscape of legacy, grief, and remembrance.
Exactly. And this brings us to a fascinating sociological part of the source material. It discusses how, for families who have lost loved ones, the gray ribbon itself physically transforms.
How so?
It goes from being a symbol of public health awareness to a deeply intimate symbol of remembrance. And the text specifically highlights the role of organizations in facilitating this, pointing to the funeral program site.
Yes. The text notes that organizations like the Funeral Program Site provide one of the largest selections of customizable, ready-to-wear brain cancer awareness ribbons.
When I first read that, I paused, because normally an awareness ribbon is a mass-produced universal symbol. You buy a spool of gray fabric at a craft store, you fold it over, you put a 60-pin in it. It represents an abstract statistical category, brain cancer awareness.
Right. It's broad.
But what we are talking about here is the psychology of personalization. These organizations allow families to print names, dates of birth and passing, and specific heartfelt messages directly onto the fabric of the ribbon for memorial services.
Which takes a universal symbol of a macroscopic public health crisis and forcefully distills it into an intimate, singular human focus.
Yes. Think about the psychological state of a family planning a celebration of life. The end stages of glioblastoma are clinically dramatic.
Very.
The last memories are often of hospital beds, sterile rooms, IV drips, the hum of oxygen concentrators, and the loss of the person's faculties. The disease threatens to overwrite the patient's entire life story with the trauma of their death.
The clinical machine threatens to erase the human legacy.
So the act of memorialization becomes an act of defiance. The family needs to reclaim the identity of the person they love. I was thinking about this when reading about the customizable ribbons. A personalized ribbon from the funeral program site acts almost like a wearable micro-memoir.
A wearable micro-memoir. That perfectly captures the psychological utility of the object.
It's a physical artifact that takes this massive, abstract pteroglioblastoma, the grim statistics of the complex medical jargon, and grounds it back in a specific name and a specific face.
Beautifully said.
By pinning a ribbon that says, "In loving memory of Sarah, 1975-2026," to their lapel, the family is essentially making a public declaration. They're saying, yes, this disease is a monster, but my mother's legacy is bigger than the pathology that took her. Her name goes on top of the gray.
That is a profound insight. The act of ordering those ribbons, of selecting the font, of choosing the precise phrasing, of handing them out at the door of a memorial service. It is an active, tangible step in the healing process.
It gives them agency.
Exactly. It provides a sense of agency in a situation where the family has felt utterly powerless for months or years. It helps transition their focus from the clinical trauma of the final weeks back to the celebration of the actual vibrant life that was lived prior to the diagnosis.
It reclaims the person from the MRI machine.
Exactly. We talked earlier about how the physical tumor attacks the patient's identity in the brain. The personalized ribbon is the family's final, lasting counter-argument. It says, no, the tumor did not have the final say on who this person was. We remember. We hold the identity now.
And think about the physical unity that creates at a memorial service or a celebration of life. Picture 100 people walking into a hall, congregating, crying, laughing, and every single one of them is wearing the exact same gray ribbon with the exact same name resting over their heart.
It's a powerful visual.
It fosters this immediate, visceral, visual sense of belonging. The patient's story doesn't end with a sterile time of death on a chart. It continues dynamically as a beacon of shared love in the community.
That visual unity is crucial for combating the isolation of grief. Seeing your specific private sorrow mirrored on the lapels of 100 other people provides a tremendous amount of psychological comfort. It validates the weight of the loss.
But here's where the narrative arc of our source material becomes truly incredible. Because these personalized tributes, these wearable micro-memoirs, they don't just exist in a vacuum of private, quiet mourning. They don't just stay in the memorial hall.
No, they do not. They become the catalyst for the next phase.
They're the very fuel that drives the broader public fight against the disease. Let's transition into the final major horizon of our deep dive: community, advocacy, and hope. How does the gray ribbon move from a symbol of personal grief to an engine of scientific revolution?
This is where we see the full, breathtaking life cycle of the awareness movement. The source text makes a clear, direct connection between personal tragedy and macroscopic public health advocacy. The gray ribbon ultimately symbolizes collective action.
Let's map out that cause and effect relationship, because when we talk about advocacy, it can sound like an abstract buzzword. But the reality is highly economic and highly scientific.
It starts with the personal. The family who just planned that memorial service, who handed out those personalized ribbons, is left with a profound sense of injustice. They realize the treatments weren't good enough. They realize the diagnostic tools were too slow. And that grief, or in the case of survivors, that intense gratitude fuels a desperate desire to do something to change the paradigm.
And that desire translates into organizing community events. The 5K awareness walks, the charity galas, the cycling events.
Exactly. Picture that same community of 100 people who wore the customized ribbon at the funeral. Now, a year later, they show up to an awareness walk. They are still wearing the ribbon, but now they aren't just walking. They are mobilizing resources. They are generating funds.
And where do those funds go? Because this is the crucial link.
Those grassroots funds flow directly into the laboratories. The massive government grants are essential, but private foundation money raised by these families is often the seed money for cutting-edge, high-risk, high-reward research.
The stuff that's too experimental for traditional grants.
Right. The personalized ribbon essentially buys the pipettes. It buys the hours of time on the electron microscope. It funds the genomic sequencing for precision medicine we discussed. It underwrites the clinical trials testing the CRT cell immunotherapy.
So the family mourning their mother is literally funding the scientific breakthrough that will save someone else's mother a decade from now.
Yes, it is a direct pipeline from personal grief to clinical cure. And the advocacy goes beyond just laboratory funding. The voices of these organized advocates demand systemic changes. They demand better support services and insurance coverage for caregivers. And crucially, they drive public health education initiatives.
Let's circle back to Section 2 for a moment, the subtle symptoms. The mundane headaches, the occasional clumsiness, the slight personality shifts that the brain masks through the Monroe-Kelly hypothesis. The sources point out that a major goal of advocacy is early symptom education.
Where do you think that push for education originates?
It comes directly from the families who say, "I wish we had known."
Precisely. It comes out of the nightmare of retrospective clarity. The family who thought a persistent morning headache was just stress, or the spouse who thought the sudden irritability was just a midlife crisis until the tumor grew too large and the seizure happened.
They realized the signs were there.
Yes, and they are the ones standing up in front of microphones demanding public health campaigns. They take their specific, agonizing tragedy and leverage it to protect complete strangers. They are trying to change the cultural baseline so the next family recognizes the signs before the tumor infiltrates the eloquent tissue.
That is an incredibly powerful alchemy, turning the deepest trauma into a shield for someone else. And it brings a whole new level of respect and weight to the concept of survivorship as well. The sources emphasize that while glioblastomas and aggressive tumors are devastating, there are survivors, and their stories are central to the movement.
Survivorship stories are the biological proof of concept. They are essential.
Think about the impact of a survivor at one of those community walks. For a newly diagnosed patient who is terrified, who has just read the grim statistics online, seeing someone standing on a stage, 5 years post-diagnosis, wearing a gray ribbon not in memorial but in victory, that is electrifying.
It changes everything.
It offers a lifeline of tangible hope that no medical chart, no oncologist's reassurance can provide.
It proves that the high-wire active treatment can be successfully navigated. It proves the bomb can be diffused without destroying the web. It validates every single hour spent in a clinical trial and every single dollar raised for precision medicine.
It proves that the investment in research is yielding actual, living, breathing results.
And the source text concludes by looking at this future horizon. It states that the gray ribbon will remain the central unifying symbol. It represents a continuous, evolving loop.
Let's trace that loop because it summarizes everything we've explored today in this deep dive.
It starts with the anatomy, the profound complexity of the gray matter itself. When a tumor strikes, the subtle symptoms require a new level of cultural awareness to detect. Once detected, the terrifying reality of the diagnosis mobilizes an intense medical response, the high-wire act of surgery, radiation, and the frontiers of precision immunotherapy.
Meanwhile, the caregivers are engaged in a grueling marathon of ambiguous loss, anchoring the patient to reality as the tumor threatens their very identity.
When the medical battle ends, the family reclaims that identity through memorialization, using personalized tributes to process the trauma and celebrate the human legacy.
And that legacy fuels the advocacy. The awareness leads to grassroots funding, the funding leads to high-level laboratory research, the research leads to better, highly targeted treatments. Better treatments lead to more survivors, and those survivors stand up, share their stories, and generate even more awareness.
It is an unstoppable engine of human resilience. And even in the face of profound loss, the memorialization efforts ensure that the advocacy, the funding, and the scientific progress never ever stop.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've gone from the microscopic tight junctions of the blood-brain barrier to the macroscopic power of community fundraising. From the aggressive, root-like infiltration of a glioblastoma to the profound psychological concept of ambiguous loss.
It's been a journey.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Whether you tuned in because you are a neuro-oncology student brushing up on mechanics, whether you are a caregiver currently sitting in a sterile hospital waiting room needing validation, or whether you are just an intensely curious mind who wanted to understand the world a little better today, understanding the mechanics and the humanity of this disease makes you a vital part of the awareness movement.
Knowledge is the prerequisite for empathy, and empathy is the prerequisite for advocacy.
Exactly. Knowing why the ribbon is gray, knowing the subtle, mundane signs to look out for, understanding the crushing emotional weight carried by caregivers, and recognizing the profound need for personalized memorialization, it all matters. You don't have to be a neurosurgeon to contribute. Wearing or even just deeply understanding the gray ribbon is an active, meaningful step toward a more compassionate, educated, and well-funded world.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, drawing from the core philosophical thread of everything we've discussed today. Because brain cancer targets the very organ that generates our consciousness, our memories, and our sense of self, the fight against it isn't just a clinical fight to prolong biological life.
Right.
It is a profound philosophical fight to preserve the essence of human identity. It forces us to confront what makes us who we are. When you look at the gray ribbon, ask yourself, what does our medical, emotional, and communal response to this terrifying disease teach us about the intense fragility and the absolutely incredible, unyielding resilience of who we fundamentally are?
That is a question that will stay with me for a very long time. It brings us right back to where we started. The standard X-ray machine might give us the comforting illusion of clean, binary answers. Broken or not broken. Alive or not alive. But the truth of human existence, the truth of our gray matter, is infinitely more complex, infinitely more murky, and ultimately infinitely more beautiful to fight for. Thank you for joining us for this special deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep supporting each other, and we'll see you next time.